Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Bill Hayward, and this is our Tuesdays to Your Health monthly webinar series. It's great to have everyone here. It's nice to be doing this in October. It's 90 degrees in Mill Valley, which is a little bit odd, but we're really delighted to really have a special guest this evening. So I thought I'll just spend a moment or two bringing us all up to date a little bit, just to catch you up on things with respect to Blue Wave Medicine and our webinar series. So we do these once a month, as you know, on the second Tuesday of the month for the most part. And tonight we are fortunate to be able to talk about healthy homes, and given the amount of time we're all spending in our homes, it's a really fortuitous time, and I'm really excited and grateful to have Bill join us. We're going to restart the COVID talks again. I gave it a couple month hiatus, hoping that the main media would sort of channel in real information and disinformation would go down, but it feels like it's a good time to actually ramp that back up. So look forward to those again. And if you're interested in that, please sign up on our website, bluewavemedicine.com. Sign up, because for those, actually, we don't widely publicize them. You can also go to our YouTube channel, Dr. Brad Jacobs' YouTube channel. Just hit the subscribe button, and then you'll get these Tuesdays to Your Health talks that we post up onto YouTube, as well as the COVID talks that I've been doing. And sometimes I bring in special guests as well. So, well, welcome. Glad to have everyone here. The format for this evening is going to be pretty conversational. So Bill's going to do a bit of a presentation for us. I'm going to ask a few questions. I'd love it for you guys to put some questions in. So if you, as Bill is talking, if you want to put it into the Q&A box, down the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A box. Put in some questions as things come up for you, or you may already have questions in your mind. And on the second half of our hour, we'll spend some time answering those questions. If Bill can answer them, I'll answer them, and if neither one of us can answer them, then we'll throw it up as a coin toss to figure out the answer in the future. So it's a great pleasure to introduce Bill. Bill Hayward I've known for about 7 years now, and initially he came up to Cavallo Point, and we did a sort of an overall executive health weekend with him and a group of folks. And then ever since then, we've been working together in many forums. Bill was originally, he'll tell you maybe a bit of a story, but was originally in the lumber industry. And then he had a personal story that I'm sure he'll share with you that then pivoted his career. And now he's really 100% focused, 110% focused, that's how Bill operates, on helping people create healthy homes. And he's done tremendous work in this regard. He lives down in the Monterey, Carmel area, and it's really a delight to have him here. So I feel really fortunate to have him. So Bill, thanks for coming. I'll hand it over to you for the next 20 minutes or however long, and then we'll engage some questions.
Thanks, Brad. And I hope that this format gets very conversational. I'm going to do a short presentation for about 15 minutes to frame the discussion, and then we can go to some good conversation. So Brad already mentioned it. I began life really in a 100-year-old family lumber business that's located down in the Monterey Peninsula and spans from Malibu to San Francisco. And so I've been around housing and construction and how homes get built all my life. That's really what I've done. I became a high-performance consultant in construction as I was CEO of the company. And then we bought our dream house. And we moved into a house in Pebble Beach. And when we moved in, we started to get sick. When the fans would run, we would start to sneeze. And then we were exhausted. And then we were extremely exhausted. And then my wife, who's a doctor with 2 PhDs and a master's in psychology, says, well, it must be because we have a new baby. Who's not tired because we have a new baby? But by winter, I couldn't hold a 10-digit phone number in my head long enough to dial it. And Adriana was no longer able to get pregnant. And our daughter had green stuff coming out of her nose, and there were hives, and there were unusual conditions and reactions to things that we had never before reacted to. and I was falling asleep in meetings, and I couldn't think clearly, and I came to the conclusion that I thought I needed to sell my 100-year-old business in order to support myself. This was back in '09. And so we finally tested the house, and we found there was a significant mold problem in the house, along with other problems. And whoa, okay, so we moved out, and we started to get better. And that was a shock to me. So I did some research, and I found the EPA itself told us that half the homes in America had an indoor air quality problem that made people sick. Wait a minute, I'm a housing insider. How could that possibly be? And I had not known about it. So now I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. The first is, have you ever wondered if your home is impacting your health? Now, we don't have the benefit of being in an audience, but whenever I ask this question amongst architects, builders, homeowners, about 60% of the audience raises their hand, which tells me many people have thought about it. Okay, the next question. When all the doors and windows are closed in your house, where does the air you breathe come from? Again, if we had a live audience, people would say things like, from the house? Yeah, but how's the air get in the house? Cracks, walls, furnace, crawl space, leaks in? Yes, precisely. And does any of that sound like sources of fresh air? No. And this is the unintended consequence of the way that we build our houses. So it turns out we're warm, air's rising, air is escaping out of our homes maybe 5-6 times an hour because of the way they're built, and the new air is getting sucked in. And with it, it brings dust, dirt, moisture, mold spores, dampness. In the Bay Area, we know what that air looks like. It's full of fog. And over time, the walls will become a biology experiment. So outdoor pollutants, if there are near the freeway, near an industrial area, outdoor pollutants get pulled into the house too. And once they get inside the house, they stay. So it turns out that outdoor pollutants are about 5 times higher indoors than they are outdoors. Then our buildings are built with lots of building materials, and all of them have lots of chemicals. And so between the chemicals and personal care items and cleaning supplies, the homes that we live in, which are our treasures and our castles, turn out often to contain harmful air and things that impact our health. Okay, so that's not good. How did this happen? How did we get here? Well, we think that governments and watchdog groups and regulatory agencies are watching out for this, but in fact, they are not. The indoor air is unregulated. And today, as we understand that COVID is airborne, and we find out the schools have poor ventilation, and we find out the office buildings have poor ventilation, and retail space, we find out that we have completely neglected ventilation, both in our homes and our country. And the impact on our health, not just beyond being COVID resilient, is significant. So let's think about the basics of life: food, water, air, and sleep. Most of that happens in our house, right? We eat 3 meals a day. If you don't like one of them, you can pass. We drink about 8 glasses of water a day. If you don't like one of them, you can pass. But we breathe 20 breaths a minute and 23,000 breaths a day. Try passing on your next breath. It's not an option. And so by that, we are hardwired to believe we just really don't have a choice about the air we breathe. And we think we just got to take it. Well, it turns out it's one of the more actionable things in our world. So we live in a home, and in a home, we can actually make a decision, particularly if we have the means to make the decision, and we can build the home tight, and then instead of let toxins collect inside it, we can ventilate it right. And suddenly the home becomes a fresh air experience and a healthy, enduring, long-term experience. Why do I know all this? Well, I told you a little bit about my background, 4th-generation lumberman. One time I chaired the Forest Stewardship Council, with the standard for sustainable, well-managed forestry globally. And I've been named one of the 20 most influential leaders in my industry. And my wife has quite a resume of as a doctor. And then I run this 100-year-old company. And so from that, we had the resources to set out and solve the problem of unhealthy homes. And we came up with 5 principles. We wanted to make it simple so that anybody could access it. Continuous fresh air, proper sealing and insulation, less toxic materials, less toxic because there's no such thing as non-toxic, cleanable surfaces, and finally, healthy home habits. And that set of principles can significantly change how a home supports our health and longevity. So using the principles, I built a house in Carmel, California. If you've been down to Carmel, on the corner of Ocean and Carmelo is this house, first Hayward Healthy Home. We now have 6 years of data coming out of the home and how it impacts health. I've seen it change my family's health. It's been stunning. So we studied the house itself, and we did a tremendous job putting the materials in and ensuring it had fresh air. So we wanted to measure how many TVOCs, volatiles, are inside the house and particles, because this is supposed to be a super healthy house. And we spent 2,000 hours making sure the building materials didn't have any significant toxin in them. That's a lot of time. We made that list public. Okay, when we turn the ventilation off, you can see that the TVOCs, those things that evaporate from chemicals, grew to 1,300. That's a really high number. That's a headache-creating environment. And most new homes don't have ventilation. So you would find higher accumulation. But when the ventilation was turned back on, within an hour, it came down to around 300. The World Health Organization would like us to keep it under 500. So would most of the new building standards like WELL and LEED. Now, with ventilation on, you see those little curves to the right. Those are daily spikes. I had all this thousands of dollars worth of equipment ticking away in the house. And as the kids would wake up and we'd measure it, you could see the little curves were small. But if there had been no ventilation, those curves would be very high. And so what does that really mean? If we can keep those curves low, we can keep the particles and exposure to chemicals low, we're just lowering our body burden. And with less weight on our body can function better, we can sleep better, and when we sleep, a lot of important functions happen in terms of recovery, cleaning out the brain, cleaning out the body. And when that's disrupted, it dysregulates both health and our capacity to live our fullest life. So we've all known this. And for how long have we been saying, I can't think clearly, I just need some fresh air? Oh, about as long as we've been going in conference rooms, in stuffy buildings, and homes, right? When the air is heavy, it doesn't feel good. Harvard studied this, thankfully. And what they did is they looked at people like you and I, and in an office building environment, and they looked at the average air quality inside office buildings, and then they took a 45-minute cognition test at the end of every day. And this was cognitive function in a typical building. But look what happens when you went to this enhanced air. Cognition in these categories improved anywhere between 60 and 260%, particularly in the frontal lobe functions. So they demonstrated very clearly CO2 particles and VOCs have a tremendous impact on our cognition. But we also know they have a tremendous impact on our health function. But for those of us on this call who are trying to optimize our life, live our best life, who wouldn't want to be in a home where you have better air quality and higher cognitive capacity? So how do you get there? These are HRVs. These are the basic tools that are used today to make homes and retail spaces healthy with fresh indoor air. If you happen to have one of these on your house during the fire, all your air in your house is coming in without particulate because it's getting filtered, it's getting cleaned, it matches the temperature inside through the heat recovery, and it fills the house full of fresh indoor air. And it allows you to manage your airflows in a predictable way. And with risk management, we like predictable. It also means that if you're living in a house with one of these, or you're doing good HEPA filtration in your house, which is another way to at least clean particles, not CO2, you are more resilient to COVID risk because the less particles in your lung, the less air pollution you live around, the more resilient your lungs are. That's one of the things we found in this COVID research. Now, just for a moment, during the time when the fires were going on, people were really struggling with air. And there was a lot of talk about box fans as a way to solve it. So you could go out and buy an $800 HEPA filter, but you could also go to the store and buy a $25 box fan and put a $50 HEPA filter on it with tape. And then you could tape it into your window and you could fill your house full of fresh air. And because we're in California, not North Dakota, the temperatures allow us to do that. This same box fan tool could be used to ventilate a restaurant and create the kind of air changes that now the public health officials are saying would allow us to move to indoor dining The question being, when does indoor air become as safe as outdoor air? And the answer from the public health officials that you can read about, Joe Allen and Lindsay Marr, is 6 air changes per hour. And you can do that for $400 or $500 to almost any building in the Bay Area with box fans. So it's just a useful tip to kind of hack the more expensive long-term fixes like HRVs. Okay, so in my journey, we wanted to understand more. We needed to help more people. So I reached into my experience from the FSC and created Hayward Score. And Hayward Score today has now scored over 78,000 homes across America. So it's a consumer-friendly tool. It's free. And if you go online and answer 15 minutes of questions about your house, you'll get your score. It'll tell you if it's impacting your health, and it'll tell you how to fix it based on the climate that you live in. This is the largest study on health and housing ever completed. So there it is, the process. User input on your phone, laptop, goes through the algorithms, provides a report, which when people look at it, like, yeah, I get it. I can see if I can do those things, I bet I'm going to feel better. And in fact, people tell us that they do feel better. So now we have thousands of responses of people who said, I fixed my house and I got better. This is what it looks like. These are the kinds of advice that you get, how to store your chemicals, how to solve moisture problems, all again based upon the climate you live in. Why is this house thing so important? Richard Corsi is one of the more famous indoor air experts in the country. And the Corsi Code says, look, if you're going to live to be 79, you spend 69 years indoors, because we are the indoor generation now. We all live indoors. And in COVID, maybe it's going to be 79. And 54 at home and 26 in bed. So the time in the seat is really important. And since we spend all our time at home, that's where we are. And now that we understand that health and longevity, 60% of health and longevity is determined by environmental pollutants. And if we think, oh, wait a minute, the environment's not out there, I'm breathing the environment during the 90% of the time I'm indoors, then that 60% factor is when I'm indoors. And if I change my indoor air, I'm going to change my health. So here's data from 50,000 of the homes. And I share it because it's absolutely stunning. Whenever I share it with doctors, they're always amazed. But on the right in the green, you see homes that scored 75. And people self-report their symptoms. These are the 23 we track. And you can see the frequency by which they report symptoms. So for instance, depression, 17%. Now, if I move to the left of the worst homes, 39%. You see that almost all the symptoms nearly double in the worst homes. Average home in America is around 50. Many of you own more than one home. And we supply a lot of homes in Santa Barbara and Pebble Beach. And I talk to people all the time. Like, yeah, I've had a home with a water problem. We got sick. It wasn't good. So we all know those things happen, but the data's here. It's really revealed the truth now about health and housing and how important our homes are for our long-term health and wellness. In this process, we learned that about 40% of what makes a home healthy are actually healthy home habits. Do I run the range hood? How often do I vacuum? What do I clean with? Where do I store chemicals? Things that don't cost hardly anything to fix, and once you know, impact your score and your health. We also released the 12 steps to make a code home healthy, along with the cost. And believe it or not, on an affordable level entry home house, the premium is only 10 grand. So the myth of it being not affordable isn't correct. You just have to do it differently. Very quickly, the top 5: ventilation, ventilation, ventilation. No particle board, OSB volatile paints, foam insulation. Those are all impactful. Kitchen and cooking is significant, right? A lot of particulate and carcinogens come from cooking and cooking gases. And if you go to an induction rain hood with great ventilation, you eliminate that. And it turns out that the connection between our homes and our garage is a leaky one. And since we put all the stuff we don't want in our house and our garage and our lawnmower and all kinds of other stuff in there, if we don't have a good seal, you're breathing all that. We say at Hayward Score, if it's in your garage, it's in your house. And finally, if you're doing a remodel or you're doing construction, it's at least 2 days of cleaning dust inside every space, because the dust holds the entire record of the construction project in all the chemicals that were used. So you've heard it from me. Beautiful book by the team at Harvard, Joe Allen at T.H. Chan School of Public Health, Healthy Buildings, and the dean of the business school. And basically says your building owner has more to do with your health than your doctor. Can't tell Brad that. We say your home has more to do with your health than your doctor. And now that we know housing affordability, the cost of healthcare are forever inseparable, because healthcare spend goes up when house is worse. So here's a couple of thoughts about the impact during COVID. We now know that if you're in a 40 to 60% humidity in your living space in your office, there's less capacity for COVID to spread. The hospital studies demonstrated that. If you're around less particulate on a daily basis, your lungs are in better condition to be resilient. And now that the home is the workplace and school, if we can reduce the CO2 and particulates in the home, there's just less anxiety, less frustration. It's a better place to live. When those things are high, CO2, particulate, chemicals, I, as an executive, start getting antsy. I start to move around. I don't want to sit still. I fall asleep, right? I don't feel good, and I can get sick easier. So these are all benefits of a healthy home. And with that, here's the family. My goal is every family lives healthy, and everybody has access to the knowledge to live in a healthy home. This picture is one of my favorite pictures. These guys were in the Tour de France in the 20s. And at the time, they believed if they smoked a cigarette before they climbed a mountain pass, they could climb faster and harder. Probably one of the first performance-enhancing drugs, or at least so they thought. Well, this is where we are with housing. Housing has way more impact than we want to give it credit for. We need to figure that out, and when we do, we're going to live healthier lives. So Brad, thank you for the opportunity to share this set of thoughts, and I'm looking forward to open discussion and seeing what people want to talk about.
Thanks, Bill. That was fabulous. That was quite a tour. So I'd love to have people, if you could, submit in the chat box or the Q&A box questions. Please submit your questions. If you have problems or can't figure it out, let us know as well. In the meantime, I'll ask you a few questions, because you're so immersed in this now. There's a lot of terminology that I think is beyond our understanding, at least my understanding. So one question is, let's do the basics, Bill. So HRV, what does that mean? What is ventilation? You know, HVAC, HVAC means heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. No one's ever paid attention, including contractors, I spoke to the V part of HVAC, right? People do their heating, and depending on where you are in the Bay Area, your air conditioning. What the heck's ventilation? And what's that mean, and what's HRV?
That's a great place to start. So HVAC is a big misnomer. For 20 years, it's heating and cooling, and ventilation is almost always neglected and rarely is done. So as a residential home, you might think, gosh, my home's supposed to have outdoor air. There is no legal requirement until this year's code, and nobody's doing it yet, to bring in outside air. In commercial spaces, there's a requirement, and there's a thing called an economizer, and often they're not turned on, or they don't function when it's too hot or cold. Right? So what happened in the 70s, we had this energy crisis, and everybody said, well, tighten the buildings up and don't let outdoor air in because it costs too much to heat and cool it. Well, now we have really efficient heating and cooling, and we really need ventilation. So ventilation means I'm going to bring air into the house. And under a healthy home format, we think that should be enough air to replace the volume of the air every 2 hours in a house. Now, where Lindsay Marr and the public health experts said if you were going to move dining indoors, you want to replace it 6 times an hour, not once every 2 hours. And that's about a hospital emergency room, right? It's a really pleasant experience to be in 6 air changes an hour, but it's not necessary for a residential home to create a healthy indoor environment.
And HRV?
Yes. So HRV is kind of a fun thing. It means heat recovery ventilator. And when you go to your builder or your consultants and you ask them about it, they're going to say, what? Well, they've been around in Europe for over 20 years. They're prominent in high performance buildings. It's just most of the industry doesn't know. So it's a box about this big, or if it's a retail store, it's the size of the couch I'm sitting on. And it brings 100% new air in It goes through a core filter in the middle that exchanges heat. So if it's 40 degrees outdoors, that 40-degree air warms up to 68 degrees and comes in the house. You don't feel a breeze. It goes through filters. It's clean. And the old air gets pulled out. So you're extracting old air out. And that means CO2 is being taken out, VOCs, particles. In the COVID context, it means it's being pulled out and spit outside the building. It's being eliminated and new air is coming in. And that's what creates great ventilation. Filtration, you'll hear a lot of talk about spot filtration, particularly in restaurants. Filtration is a Hepa filter. I can filter stuff out of the air, like particles and COVID, but I can't take CO2 out of the air. And CO2 is basically from us breathing, right? So often if a couple's in bed at night sleeping, we have sometimes dogs in our bed, right? The CO2 in the room will get up to 1,300, 1,600, 1,800. That's going to cause a headache. That's going to degrade sleep. You'd like to sleep at night with the CO2 no higher than 700. And the beauty of this whole discussion of indoor air quality is you can now buy for $169 a really nice indoor air quality instrument and measure your house. Aware, AWAIR.com has a fantastic one. And some of the newest air filtration systems like Mila, MILA.com, have all the instruments built into them. So you can clean your air and know how much CO2, know whether your kitchen's causing too many kitchen gases or your garage. And it also shows up on your iPhone. So we can now see what used to be invisible. This issue of indoor air was invisible, but the instruments now are on our iPhone and they send us text messages and they suggest that you open windows and store your chemicals differently.
So that's called Mila.com.
Yeah.
And aware.com.
Aware.com. And it might be Mila, M-I-L-A cares, C-A-R-E-S .care.
Great. So those both have devices. You could buy them and sort of help and measure what's going on in your indoor environment.
And it becomes very real when you say, gosh, I noticed the kids are sneezing and my Aware's turning red. Oh, and it's saying that there's a lot of particles, right? And then you start to notice what are the conditions. The neighbor's running the barbecue, the car just came home, the garage is full of garage gases and they're coming in the house, right? You can start to notice and then make changes.
So the current heating and air conditioning units, I have a heater in my home. I've replaced the filter recently, so it's an MERV 19. I think you wanted about 13. My intake, if I understand this correctly, my intake, thanks to you, I've become more and more interested in this. The intake sort of panels are in my home. They suck air from in my home that goes down through the heater, the furnace, through that filter, heats the air and pushes it back in. So I'm basically recirculating the same air. Is that correct?
You are. So you're recirculating the same air, but you're cleaning it with that Hepa filter. And there's been a bunch of studies that show that that has a nice little impact on improving health. Just the cleaning of the air alone. And most of us in the Bay Area have forced air heat. So that's just recirculating the air. A lot of us moved to radiant. And so now there's no recirculating or airflow, which is great if you have allergies, but there's no air. And when you're walking, when the kids are playing, that sheer act of that re-entrains, is the term, all the particles that are on the ground, they get back up in the air, they carry dust and chemicals and things on them, and they get back in our lungs. Now, you've heard a lot of talk about, and the forest fires were a great example. Some days you felt like you had a rough chest. Those were on the days where the particles were big, PM10, which is 10 micron or bigger. On the days where you just didn't feel good and your tummy hurt and you couldn't think clearly and had a headache, they were high PM 2.5, which are 2.5 micron and smaller. They go past the villi down into the lung deep, I guess into the villi, and get absorbed into the bloodstream. And those are the ones that lead to things like cancer and long-term health effects. So filtering those things out, which we can do inside our home, really improve health, and particularly during these events like the fires.
Great. Well, let's go to some of the questions. There's a lot. there's a lot of questions.
Yeah.
So let me I'll read them to you and
Yep.
love to get your thoughts. So I have chronic health issues. I've had chronic health issues for years. I've actually worked on them. Wondered recently if part of the problem is our gas stove that's never been ventilated. I do a lot of cooking. And for the last bunch of months, we've been putting a floor fan in the kitchen out to the garage. Any recommendations?
Yeah, so that my guess is that means you're opening the garage door. About 20% of air that usually gets into the house gets in through the garage house connection, and generally speaking, the air in the garage isn't healthy. And then taking the fan and blowing whatever's coming from the kitchen is only spreading it around the house. What you really want to do is eliminate it. Lawrence Berkeley Laboratories here in the Bay Area has done some of the best kitchen gas studies, and they've been really profoundly changing the way we think about kitchens. The Indoor Chem Group had a month-long experiment in Austin where they cooked every day with $3 million worth of test equipment. And they found that a good, serious set of cooking can be as impactful as a bad day in New Delhi in terms of pollutants. So the idea of a proper ventilation, A, B, ideally moving away from gas, although you can ventilate gas well, to induction. Induction cooks at a lower temperature, 1,000 degrees instead of 1,600, less particulate. And then adding some makeup air, either you crack the window when you're running the fan, or you introduce formally makeup air at your feet, which is what I'm doing in my new house. That's how you really tackle kitchen ventilation. So if you're finding you're more impacted during a time when you are cooking more, we guess that the kitchen gases are having a high impact on you.
Great. And I think what she's doing is pushing it, sounds like, into the garage. So again, that allows some of that, whatever's in the garage, to come in as well.
Let me just talk about that for a second. The idea, Mother Nature is an unpredictable thing. So on one day when we open the window here, the air blows in, and then if you watch the curtains, on another day it goes out. Depends on which side of the house is pressurizing and depressurizing. And when there's a bigger temperature differential outside than inside, the house sucks more air inside. So some days that garage connection is going this way, and other times it's going that way, which is, if you pay attention to it, then you can start to predict it, but it's typically unpredictable. And if you want to be away from garage gases and the kitchen cooking, you really have to install ventilation.
Fabulous. You had mentioned also, as a tip for folks in offices and other places too, open windows on sort of opposite sides of the building, so that will allow for cross draft, either, yes, whatever direction it is. So I'll just sort of restate that.
Yeah, and that's a simple piece of advice, but it's super good. It's really about CO2, right? With kitchens, we need to filter it out. With HEPA, we can filter particles, but you can't get rid of CO2. And so if the kids have a little classroom set up and there's 3 of them in there, the CO2 is going to be pretty high and they're going to have trouble concentrating. But if you literally crack a window on either side of the room, and not a lot, just enough to feel the air on the back of your hand, and every day it's different depending on the nature's conditions. Some days it's this big, some days it's this big in the winter, but just enough that will dissipate the CO2, and it's a low-cost, easy way to make staying indoors and staying in office buildings much more comfortable.
So let's try some other questions. So where do we begin to test our home? Where do we begin to test our home? So I take that to mean, like, how do we start? So you had mentioned these going to Aware and Mila Cares. I also, first do an assessment. So I'll just say, I'll speak to the Hayward Score. It's a great survey instrument. I encourage you guys to go online and fill it out and see what your score is. And on the backside of that, there's a whole bunch of useful tools. But I like the other part of measurements. It'd be nice to bring machines into your home and measure stuff. Bill, what do you say? I do my assessment, I get a score of 40 or 60, not great. What do I do next?
Yeah, so a couple of steps, right? The Hayward Score is free. You get your assessment. You'll see the advice. You can start to implement that. the reason Hayward Score works is because you know your home better than any inspector that's going to come in for a day, even if they bring $50,000 worth of equipment. You've lived in it during wet and dry cycles. You know where the odors come from. You just don't really know necessarily what they all mean. So the Hayward Score will give you a lot of clues about what it means with fixes. You buy a $160 instrument. Now it helps you figure out, oh, that room is the one that seems to have the problem. The next step, though, is usually involves a contractor. And so for that, you'd want to go to the guys that called Healthy Building Sciences out of Berkeley. And I really trust them, like them a lot. They're good, healthy building scientists. They'll come in, they'll walk your home. They'll listen so carefully to what you've said. Then they'll do some testing and they'll look at different spaces and help you finalize a plan to fix the house. So that's really the next step. To understand exactly what's happening on the ground in detail.
Healthy Building Scientists?
Healthy Building Science.
Science.
It's the name of their company.
So there's a person who asked, if I want to buy a home, how do I know it's not a sick home? So any thoughts about that?
Yeah. So realtors love to have all the doors and windows in the Bay Area open when you arrive because it's awesome. But that means you don't get to smell what the house smells like. And the odor of a house tells you a lot about the house. So I would not personally buy a house without bringing guys like the ones from Healthy Building Science in. After I got down to 2 or 3, what I typically do if I'm looking for a house with somebody is I go in and I take the Hayward Score on each house, because we ask a detailed checklist set of questions. And when you plug them in, 80% of the time, that free Hayward Score is more accurate than a $700 inspection. It's a good starting place, but then you want somebody to really walk it, look at it, crawl around places you probably don't want to crawl around, and make sure there aren't any hidden landmines that aren't present that day. Because honestly, some days houses are fine, and some days they don't smell good. Some days there's biological growth, and that's where you really want to bring an expert in before you buy. The challenge in the Bay Area and so many other areas right now is that the house goes on the market and they expect the offer 3 days later. So some combination of Hayward Score and being knowledgeable and bringing somebody like Healthy Building Science in is the way to do it.
Terrific. Someone else asked about, with all the recent fires, how do we help ventilate our home? I think you spoke to that a bit. Is there anything else you want to add to that?
I tell you, I was stunned myself on how well the box fans work, because I have the HRV, I have all that stuff in my house. I also am building a house right now. So we installed box fans during the fire, 6 of them, and I would measure the air quality. And on the construction site, the air was brilliant for $500. It was stunning. So that's a good fix. It really is. To just one on one side of the house to push air out, one on the other with a filter. And now you're getting pretty good clean air in the house.
Fabulous. I have another question. I have a HEPA purifier. Doors and windows are closed, minimal chemicals, and I suffer from severe allergies since I moved into my new home. I have facial swelling. My home is 20 years old. Where do I begin to test the health of my home? So that Mona asked, and does Bill Company conduct home service calls to identify concerns with home air quality and offer solutions? So that's all one person.
Yeah, we don't conduct home surveys ourselves. We provide the score as the entry level to do your own. And then the next step really is to call somebody like Healthy Building Science. But I'll tell you, my suspicion, given it's a 20-year-old home and you have allergies, you can put all the HEPA filtration you want in. That's going to help, but it's not going to bring in a lot of fresh outdoor air. And there are so many things in air that impact our health that we haven't yet studied, that there's things that just don't get filtered by the HEPA. And if there are molds or active microbial growth in the walls, which are most likely in a 20-year-old Bay Area home, they're producing what are called MVOCs, microbial volatile organic compounds. So there are mold spores, and you hear about, oh, the spores can cause allergic reaction. Well, 40% of the time when people are impacted in their home, there is no visible mold. Mold's in the wall, And when it's growing, it's producing these metabolites, the volatile MVOCs. An example of that is what's called mushroom alcohol. So when you walk in a house in the Bay Area and you smell that musty smell, that's a mushroom alcohol produced by the mold, and it's oxy-1,3. It's this particular chemical. When isolated, it inhibits the production of dopamine in human beings. So that was a new discovery by Dr. Joan Bennett, and it helps us understand how impactful these metabolites of molds are, and those do not get cleaned out by a HEPA filter. That's something you've got to look at differently, because that's a damp wetness issue as opposed to a particulate issue.
So there's a lot of questions about, this information is really helpful. How do I do something about it? It sounds like the Healthy Building Science is a company to use. Are there others out there?
So when I first got sick, I remember the one I hired saying, oh yeah, there's a lot of mold in your crawl space, but don't worry about it. You don't live in the crawl space. And he wrote it in the report. And they still do. So there are good ones. I can't tell you all of them, but I know at least Healthy Building Sciences is a good one, and they're in the Bay Area. I'm sure there are others. They're typically called industrial hygienists.
All right, so other questions. So how about a window? If I open my window at night and make sure there's not, would that help reduce carbon monoxide poisoning, and does that help bring in good ventilation?
Yeah, so opening a window again is a great idea. It's gonna reduce the CO2 in the room. But let's say you're on a 2-story house, and I'll tell you about the house I lived in after getting sick, the next house. We kept opening the window at night. This was one in Carmel, 20 years old. And it was great because we could smell the fresh air in the bedroom. It smelled good, but air rises in the house. And now that it was an air pathway, air was going out, hot air was coming from downstairs. It was pulling air out of the damp, wet crawl space. It was now going up the stairs and out the door next to where my wife was sleeping. So I was doing okay, but she started going downhill. And I remember looking at the screen going, seeing all this dust and dirt on it. But it was on the inside. And that's when I realized the airflow, the pathway in the house, was taking crawl space air past where she was sleeping. So if there are sources in the house, chemicals in the garage, mold in the crawl space, dust mites in the couch or behind the bed, you got to eliminate the source. You got to find the source and eliminate the source to achieve healthy indoor environments.
Bill, it feels like this is an industry ripe for innovation and proliferation. It feels like, it's hard for you to come up with a large number of companies. It sounds like a lot of folks out there don't really know what they're doing. And I'm wondering if, this is an area ripe for innovation. What do you think about you heading up and making this industry help mature the industry and train people to do the right thing to help everyone?
Well, so back at the Hayward lumber level, we're starting to offer training for builders and capacity to consult builders on how to make homes healthy. It's a slow process. LEED now has a health component. The Living Building Challenge has a teaching process and a health component. The Well Building Standard has a significant health component. It's in their name, right? So there are processes that are moving builders, but I'm pretty sure everybody on this phone has worked with builders. They're fairly slow to change the way they do things. And what they tell us is that, well, I would do it if the owner asked for it. So owners ask for it and then send them to us to get trained, or send them to one of these standards to get trained so that they do it right. There's the Building Performance Institute, which trains builders and industry professionals to do it right as well. But Brad, to your point, it's really ripe. And now that COVID has taught us that we will always and forever pay attention to what's in our air. And I think we're going to see an acceleration towards this whole issue of indoor air quality in healthy homes.
Yeah, I mean, COVID, there's no question that COVID has really alerted consumers, I think, citizens as well as the health professionals, to the fact that when you walk into an indoor space, you're thinking not only How close am I to this other person, and are we maintaining what I call physical distancing? I think social distancing is a misnomer. But what are the ventilation and circulation flow, airflow within the building, right? Because you could be sitting on one part in a restaurant in the indoor space, and someone else who's sick is 1,000 feet away, and that air could be being sucked up from there and dropped down into where you're seated.
You're exactly right. And I think we're all thinking about that right now. So I happened to be, it was my wife's and my anniversary, so we had a day off, and we went out into some stores, right? And I'm super thoughtful about like walking in. So the one store we walked to, the guy didn't have his mask on. I wasn't going to go in because that meant he had been filling up the room with his air. Except there were 3 open windows on either side. There was cross ventilation, and I could see that it was ventilated. So I'm like, okay, if there's low occupancy and I can feel the airflow going through here, I'm going to be in a much less risky situation in that space. So we decided to go in. The next one I went to, and it was a nice store, a couple people, and they had absolutely no ventilation, nor was the HVAC on. And I said to myself, I am simply not going in, because if anybody's got COVID in there, there's a cloud of it and I'm going to be walking amongst it. Whereas an outdoor restaurant with a reasonable spacing and randomness of airflow, there's no real river of air carrying COVID from one person to the next. All the big restaurant studies show there's a air ventilation system, and there's a table here, and the next 2 tables got it because the airflow went this way, but nobody up there got it. Right? Whereas in that more outdoor environment, 6 air changes an hour, randomness, there's no constant flow, nobody's downriver. And now you'll read after this talk about spot ventilation, ventilating the restaurant right, and then having HEPA filters in between tables, so that if somebody did have it at this table, it's going to get picked up in the HEPA filter before it gets to that table. But if you use those clues, we really all know when we're in a stuffy building, right? We know the feeling. In fact, we love the feeling when we go to a fun event and it's kind of in a great restaurant and it has ambiance and there's no air movement, right? But that's not a good environment for COVID.
No, it's not. Or many other particulate matter that's in this space.
Right.
So I have 2 other questions for you. One, what does it mean to have a ventilation rate of blank? So in your slides, 0.5 ACH. What does that mean?
Okay, so 0.5 is what we recommend for healthy homes, and ACH is air changes per hour. And so 0.5 is half an air change every hour, or 1 air change every 2 hours. Our code, our building code, suggests ACH of 0.33, which is 1 air change every 3 hours. And that just came into the 2019 code. Builders aren't doing it yet. We know from the European experience and my own, we need to at least set 0.5. And then kind of back to what the experts are saying for making indoor spaces safer, we need to get up to about 6 ACH. So that means replacing the volume 6 times an hour. In the tuberculosis studies, they found that they could minimize risk at 9 air changes per hour. And tuberculosis is much more contagious than COVID. So that 6 number seems to be holding. The second number that the public health experts are focused on is if you're in an indoor space, it's crowded, but the CO2 doesn't get above 800 or ideally 600, then as a proxy for human density, that means there's enough ventilation to kind of keep down all of our stuff from impacting each other. But if it's higher than that, again, you probably don't want to go in it.
Thank you for that. And how about particle board? So it seems to be everywhere. People, it's hard to find real wood furniture these days. You go into a store and there's glue and all this composite board. What are your thoughts about that? What are the formaldehyde and other things in there? I know HEPA filters now, some of them can remove the formaldehyde. What's your experience with that?
So we really recommend as a simple, cost-effective way to be healthier indoors is to avoid particle board and OSB. Use plywood. And if you think about, hadn't thought about it this way, but if you took all the plywood in a house and you laid it down, you'd get a stack about yay big. But we all have some pretty big kitchens, and each one of those boxes is made, if you cut all the plywood up, like 12 sheets of plywood. And you stack what's in the kitchen cabinets, and it's more plywood than in the whole house. So if you do the right thing for the house, but then you buy formaldehyde, lead, and particle board for your cabinets and your furniture, you're putting more in the house than the house itself. So it really is good to stay away from it. The second thing is plywood's regulated by California Air Board, and the OSB and particle board is not. There's no standards for it. So they tend to range in formaldehyde. They're unpredictable in formaldehyde. So rule number one is try to minimize the source, because if you have enough source, no amount of ventilation will overcome it.
It's really helpful. How about HEPA filters? Do you like any particular ones? I was reviewing Molecule, and I looked at Dyson makes a good one. And what are your thoughts about different HEPA filters out there?
Yeah, I get to interview different CEOs because they always want to tell us about their product. And again, I mentioned Miele, and the reason I did is because it stood so far heads and shoulders above anything else that I had seen, not only in its technology, its filtration system, its advice, and its onboard equipment. It can calculate ventilation rates in the house. It knows about CO2. It knows how much. It has a Doppler, so it can look at occupancy levels. I mean, it's just really a sophisticated instrument. And I'd like to see people moving towards those more sophisticated, better designed instruments.
Great.
HEPA is great, right? HEPA is the one thing that can clean the small particles. It was designed by the nuclear industry years ago to take nuclear particles out of the air. Right? And really, to date, there's nothing better than has been invented. There's lots of fancy technologies that people make claims about. I can't validate them, but I do believe in HEPA.
Great. Yeah, it's challenging. I mean, I myself recently, with all the fires and with our issues in our home with allergies, so we went ahead and I investigated all the different HEPA filters out there and read all the reviews that are out there. And it's a complicated. I ended up purchasing a Dyson. It had the heating and the cooling and the HEPA filter and the formaldehyde, and it was around, I think, $700 or $800.
Yeah.
But it seems to be working well, and it does have the measurements. You can measure the PM10, PM2.5. Interesting. So,
and having a good HEPA vacuum is really important too, because if you have anything less than a true HEPA, and it means 99.97 at 0.3 microns, right? If it doesn't have that language, it's not really HEPA. There's hospital HEPA, kind of HEPA, light HEPA-like, true HEPA. None of those. That's all false advertising, unless it says that 99.97 at 0.3.
Thank you for that. How about hotels and planes? I'll tell you what I know about planes and plane travel. You know, a lot of these planes they're supposed to do air exchanges, 6 times per hour through a HEPA filter system. It's a little complicated in that it blows from below and sucks from above. And so that's a little bit complicated. My understanding is because the COVID and viruses can sometimes go the other direction, so they end up floating theoretically. The other question that I still haven't figured out yet is how often do they actually turn on those HEPA filters on the planes that you're on? And so I know local planes aren't required to have that filtration system. Transcontinental ones are. So do you have any thoughts about that?
I do, yeah. So the guys at Harvard at the T.H. Chan School have been doing a lot of work on that. You can Google Joe Allen. Most of the big articles that you read are Joe Allen's. And so airplanes, they're really saying in the planes that have it, 6 air changes an hour is pretty good. It's good air. One of the problems they're not talking about is that before takeoff and while on taxi, it's not doing that kind of filtration. And how many of us have all fallen asleep at takeoff or at taxi? Well, that's because the plane's filling up with CO2. It doesn't have great ventilation. And if the wind's coming from behind on the taxiway, it's getting some of the jet fuel back in the plane. So the risk point is not so much in the air if you're on a good plane. It's the time in the airport getting on and then the time getting off. And again, talking to the folks at Harvard, they're starting to spray some cleaning chemicals in the airplanes that haven't really been EPA approved. So you just want to go be thoughtful, wear a mask, and the risk points are the before takeoff and at landing, I think.
Do you know why they don't use the, does it require the engines to be, is there something about mechanically that they can't do it while they're taxiing?
Yeah, I've read it many times, but the way that the air intakes were designed, they're part of the exhaust system of the plane, and it's supposed to push it out with the exhaust, but in that taxi roll, it doesn't always work so well. And there's a whole issue of taking on too many toxins in the plane. And I've traveled with, I have, $6,000 or $7,000 worth of portable air quality equipment. So I've embarrassingly traveled on airplanes to check it out for myself, and I've measured some pretty bad numbers on them.
That's good to know. So again, the devices you mentioned from the companies earlier are the ones that are portable, like we could buy them and walk around.
Yeah, you couldn't walk around with the Mila. There's one called Flow that you could walk around with, but it doesn't measure CO2. I'm sorry, the Aware. The Flow does. It's about this big. You can put it on your belt, and it's kind of interesting because as it tracks along with your phone, it starts to geographically tell you where you're exposed to bad air in your daily circle.
That's great. So let's talk a little about hotels. I know you've been doing a little consulting with a couple of the nicer hotels around, Cavallo Point being one, and Post Ranch for the Passport Resorts Collective. Love to hear your thoughts about some of the products, the titanium dioxide, these other things that people are using. We only have a few minutes left, but if you share some of that knowledge, that'd be great.
So I learned some new terminology. There's single-story hotels and stacked hotels. Those are usually group, but the leisure are usually single-story, and those really can be made pretty COVID safe. There's no hallway, no elevator, outdoor air, or simple access, ingress, egress. At least down at Post, they use this product called Act Global, and it's a titanium dioxide to put on all the hard surfaces, which actually cleans the air at the boundary layer, at the nanoparticle layer. When there's a light, and they used it in the Lindblad cruise lines, and they found the 50% reduction in spread of cold and flu, and all the funky odors on the cruise went away. So that's some of the kind of newer technologies. They were also very open about their science, which many of these companies aren't. So now that we're really coming to understand it's not so much about touch. We do know how to manage touch. We do know how to clean surfaces. I personally would like not to go in a hotel that was treated with a bleach or a chlorine product every time somebody moved in and out, because the layers of chemicals are going to build up. And then the next thing is, outdoor dining and spa. And if we can get to that 6 air changes per hour in the restaurants and the spas and manage the airflow, the ventilation, I think we can have reasonably safe hotel experiences, particularly in that kind of hotel.
Yeah, that's great. It's fantastic. The titanium dioxide compound that's put on surfaces and then with light, it becomes active and actually biodegrades toxins is phenomenal. It's really an amazing product. I remember learning about that through that group, and really interesting. It's amazing. I'm really excited. Do you have any thoughts about UV? People are using UV to try and decontaminate buildings, and they're putting them in these ventilation systems.
Yeah, I've sat in on 2 or 3 of the Harvard webinars on UV, and UV certainly has a place at a very professional, high-end level. There's dangers, there's byproducts. UV in the air system's really not so effective because, like we learned about Lysol, unless you spray the Lysol on and leave the surface glistening wet for 6 minutes, it doesn't have enough dwell time to kill COVID. Right? So none of us were ever leaving it glistening wet for 6 minutes, but we were spraying a lot of stuff on. So it was not effective. Same thing in the air. If air in a big air system is going past the UV light, it doesn't have enough time with the UV light to effectively kill much. So that's why some of these things, and there's lots of promises, are not really effective. Whereas pulling air with COVID out and spitting it outside of the building is effective. I'm eliminating it. Or HEPA, I'm cleaning it out of the air.
Yeah, fabulous. This has been a wealth of information. I really recommend folks to go to the haywardscore.com. Bill, you've put a lot of your money, your time, and your goodwill into this, and you're really helping co-create, a whole new field, both for in the health field as well as for citizens, so that we can empower ourselves and change the homes we're living in. I know you're working with the military, and think of all the military housing that's going on across America, for that matter, the planet, and the type of housing that actually that they build for active military is to say it's questionable is an understatement. So I really want to thank you for all these contributions and your generosity of heart. And I really thank you for coming on tonight. So we'll put this up on YouTube for others that want to rewatch this, that want to look at the slides again. And please feel free to share this and spread the word of what Bill Hayward's doing. So thanks again, Bill.
Thanks, Brad. I really appreciate it. And thanks for all the questions.
Yeah, it's a great group. All right. Bye-bye, everyone. Until next month.